It was October of 1988, and Earl Maddox was down to his last 36 hours. Not his last 36 hours on Earth. No, something worse than that if you've ever farmed a piece of ground that your father broke and his father before him. He was down to his last 36 hours before the Federal Land Bank of Omaha came for his deed. 412 acres in Hardin County, Iowa. Ground that had fed his family through the Depression, through 2 world wars, through drought and flood and everything in between. Ground that smelled like iron and rain and something older than memory. And now, on a gray October morning with a sky the color of old pewter, Earl Maddox walked out of his farmhouse at 4:47 in the morning, crossed a yard he'd crossed 10,000 times before, pulled open the big wooden door of his machine shed, and stood face to face with a 1948 Farmall M that hadn't moved under its own power in 3 days. 3 days, that's how long his combine had been sitting dead in the east field with a cracked cylinder head. 3 days of soybeans standing ripe and splitting in their pods while the bank's deadline moved closer like a slow-rolling storm. Earl put his hand on the Farmall's hood, cold as iron, cold as January. And then he said something out loud that nobody was there to hear. He said, "All right, old girl," one more time. "Let me tell you about what happened next. And let me tell you about the 25 years that made that moment possible." Hardin County, Iowa. If you've never been there, close your eyes and picture the absolute geographic center of the American Midwest. Picture ground so flat and so dark and so fertile that the first settlers who broke it reportedly wept, just dropped to their knees and wept, because they had never in their lives seen soil that color. Nearly black. Rich as coffee grounds, deep as sin, and patient as God. The county sits in the Iowa River Valley, roughly 70 miles north of Des Moines, and in the early 1960s it was producing some of the finest corn in the state. Eldora was the county seat, a town of maybe 3,000 souls where everybody knew everybody, where the grain elevator on 2nd Street was as much a social institution as the Lutheran Church on 4th, and where the arrival of a new piece of farm equipment at the local dealership could draw a crowd the way a movie premiere might draw one in a city. This was farm country in the truest, most unadorned sense of the word. Not romantic farm country, not the postcard version. Real farm country, muddy boots and busted knuckles and dinner on the table at noon because that's when the light was right for fieldwork, not because anybody had leisure time. In the spring of 1963, the ground was thawing out of a particularly hard winter. Farmers across Hardin County were thinking about planting, thinking about credit, thinking about what new equipment they might need to stay competitive in a rapidly changing agricultural world. The federal government's agricultural stabilization program was paying out price supports. Land values were climbing, and everywhere you looked, the big machinery companies, John Deere, International Harvester, Case, Massey, were rolling out new models with features that would have seemed like science fiction a decade before. It was a time of tremendous optimism in American agriculture. And it was the year that a man named Calvin Prout made the worst business decision of his life, though he wouldn't know it for another quarter century. Earl Maddox was 41 years old in the spring of 1963, and he looked 60. Not in a broken-down way, in an honest way, in the way that a man looks when he has spent 2 decades doing hard physical work outdoors through all 4 seasons without complaint and without regret. His face was the color of saddle leather, his hands lured his hands. His daughter Ruth would later say that her father's hands looked like they'd been carved out of something harder than wood. The knuckles were thick. The skin was permanently darkened in the creases. When he shook your hand, you knew it. He farmed 220 acres of his own ground and rented another 110 from the Sorensen estate up on Route 175. Corn and soybeans mostly, with a small herd of Angus cattle that he ran on the south pasture. He did his own mechanics. He kept his own books, not because he couldn't afford an accountant, but because he trusted his own arithmetic more than he trusted anybody else's. He paid his bills on the first of the month, every month, without exception, and he had not carried an operating loan larger than $12,000 in a single year since he took over the farm from his father in 1951. Let me tell you about Earl Maddox. He was the kind of farmer who could listen to an engine for 30 seconds and tell you exactly what was wrong with it. He could read a field, the color of the corn, the lean of the stalks, the smell of the soil after rain, the way a doctor reads an X-ray. He wasted nothing. He threw nothing away that could be repaired. He once kept a baler running for 11 years past the point where any reasonable man would have retired it. simply because he understood that machine better than its manufacturer did, and because he refused to buy a new one until he absolutely had to. And at the center of everything Earl Maddox owned, at the mechanical heart of his entire farming operation, sat a 1948 Farmall M that he had bought used in 1955 for $475. That tractor, painted International Harvester red, though the paint had faded to something closer to the color of old brick. A four-cylinder engine that produced roughly 36 horsepower at the drawbar, not much by the standards of what was coming, but more than enough for the way Earl farmed. He had rebuilt that engine himself in the winter of 1959, working in an unheated shed, wearing 2 pairs of gloves with a bare light bulb swinging overhead. He had kept meticulous records of every hour he'd worked on it, every part he'd replaced, every adjustment he'd made. There was a composition notebook in the top drawer of his desk, water-stained, spiral-bound, that documented that tractor's mechanical life the way a doctor documents a patient's chart. Earl Maddox loved that machine the way quiet men love things they depend on, not with words, with attention, with care, with the kind of devotion that shows up in small acts performed consistently over many years. He would need every bit of that devotion, because something was coming that he couldn't see yet. Calvin Pruitt had opened his John Deere dealership on Highway 20 east of Eldora in 1958, and in 5 years, he had made himself one of the most prosperous men in Hardin County. He was 44 that spring, heavyset, with the thick pink hands of a man who had never operated a piece of farm equipment himself but had sold a great deal of it to men who had. He wore pressed slacks in a county full of overalls. He drove a 1962 Buick Electra, ivory white with chrome trim in a county full of pickup trucks. He was not from Iowa. He was from Davenport originally, had moved west on a franchise opportunity, and had done well enough in 5 years to build a brick ranch house on 3 acres south of town where he kept no livestock, grew no crops, and maintained a swimming pool that was, by local consensus, at least moderately obscene. Calvin Pruitt understood the selling of machinery. He did not understand farming. He confused the two constantly, and he was surrounded by enough yes-men and loan officers and implement trade publications salespeople that nobody had yet found a way to explain the difference to him. He believed sincerely and completely that newer was always better, that horsepower was the only language that mattered, that a farmer still running equipment from the previous decade was leaving money on the table, falling behind, marking himself as a man without ambition or vision. He had a gift for making this belief sound like concern, for making condescension sound like advice. And let me tell you something about men like Calvin Pruitt. They are not evil, they are not villains in the storybook sense. They are something more complicated than that and in a way more dangerous because they believe what they're selling. They have confused the sale of things with the betterment of the people they're selling to, and they have never once sat with the gap between those two ideas. In the spring of 1963, Calvin Pruitt had a floor full of brand new John Deere 3010s and 4010s, and he needed to move them. The 4010 was a legitimate machine, 80 horsepower, new synchro-range transmission, impressive by any standard, and Calvin needed to find buyers. He needed to find men running older equipment and convince them that they were falling behind. Men like Earl Maddox. Now, I want you to picture the Hardin County Farm Bureau meeting on the evening of April 9, 1963. The meeting hall was a cinder block building on the west edge of Eldora that smelled of old coffee and heating oil and the faint, permanent ghost of cigarette smoke. About 60 farmers had gathered that evening for the spring planning meeting. Most of them knew each other. Most of them had known each other their entire lives. There were folding chairs set out in rows, a podium up front, and a table in the back with a percolator and a plate of cookies that somebody's wife had sent along. Calvin Pruitt had been invited to give a presentation on the new Deere line. He'd brought color brochures. He'd brought a projector and a screen. He stood up front in his pressed slacks and his Deere dealer's jacket, and he talked about horsepower and efficiency and the economics of modern farming, and he said things that sounded very smart to people who didn't have a reason to question them. And then, because Calvin Pruitt was the kind of man who needed an example, who needed to make a point and visually, he turned to the room and he said, "Now, I'll tell you what's holding some of you boys back. And I mean this in the most helpful way possible." He looked directly at Earl Maddox. "Earl," he said, and his voice had that particular quality of a man who has rehearsed condescension until it sounds like generosity. "What are you running out there on your place? Still got that old M?" Earl nodded once, just once. 1948, Calvin said, and he shook his head and he smiled, and several men in the room smiled along with him because that's what men do in rooms like that when someone with confidence smiles. Earl, I respect you, I truly do, but that machine is 15 years old. It's got maybe 35 horsepower on a good day. You're planting the same 220 acres you were planting before the war, and you're doing it with 1940s technology. Now I've got a 4010 sitting on my lot right now, 80 horsepower, new transmission, diesel. And I can put you in it for $4,200 with a trade. He paused. But honestly, and here Calvin Prout did something that Earl Maddox would remember for the rest of his life. He laughed, not a cruel laugh, a gentle laugh, a laugh that was somehow worse than cruelty because it was so casual, so unconsidered. Honestly, I don't know if that old M is worth the trade-in paperwork. You'd be doing yourself a favor just to call the scrap yard. The room laughed, not all of it, but enough. Earl Maddox sat very still. He did not flush, he did not look away, he did not say a word. He held his coffee cup in both hands and he looked at Calvin Prout with an expression that contained absolutely nothing, no anger, no embarrassment, no reaction whatsoever, and this, if Calvin had been wise enough to read it, would have told him everything. But Calvin wasn't wise enough, not that night. After the meeting broke up, two men came up to Earl in the parking lot. One of them, Gary Hofstadter, who farmed up near Union Township, clapped him on the shoulder and said quietly, "Don't listen to him, Earl. He's never pulled a plow in his life." Earl nodded, got in his truck, drove home. The next morning, he was in his machine shed at 5:30, changing the oil on the Farmall M, checking the valve clearances, and torquing the head bolts to the specification he had memorized years ago. He wasn't going to scrap anything. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever had somebody laugh at something you loved? Something you'd built up, cared for, given yourself to? You know that feeling, the way it sits in your chest, not like anger exactly, but like something hardening. Something that doesn't go away. Earl Maddox knew that feeling, and he channeled it into something that Calvin Prout had no framework to understand. He channeled it into patience. What Calvin Prout didn't know, what almost nobody in Hardin County fully understood, was that Earl Maddox had spent the better part of 15 years developing a relationship with that Farmall M that went well beyond what most mechanics could claim. He knew that tractor the way a surgeon knows a procedure he's performed 1,000 times. He knew the way the governor responded in cold weather versus warm. He knew the precise feel of the hand throttle when the engine was pulling hard versus loafing along. He knew that the left rear wheel bearing had a slight flat spot that made a noise that sounded worse than it was, and he knew exactly how long that bearing would go before it actually needed replacing. He'd calculated it based on hours of use and load conditions, written it down in that composition notebook, and he was right to within about 40 hours every time. More than that, and this is what's important, Earl understood something about that tractor's limitations that turned out to be an advantage nobody had anticipated. The Farmall M, at 36 drawbar horsepower, was what engineers would call a one-row-at-a-time machine for most row crop work. It couldn't pull the kind of wide equipment that was becoming fashionable in the early 1960s. It couldn't compete with the new Deere 4010 on flat ground in ideal conditions, pulling a wide disc or a 6-row planter. But Earl didn't farm ideal conditions. He farmed 220 acres of ground that had a creek bottom on the south end, a tight hillside on the northeast corner, and a wet draw through the middle of the west field that turned into a bottomless sinkhole in wet springs and early falls. He farmed ground that required finesse, not brute force. Ground that punished heavy equipment. Ground that rewarded a farmer who could feel what was happening beneath his wheels and respond accordingly. And the Farmall M, light, nimble, mechanically simple, was exactly right for that ground in a way that a $4,000 John Deere 4010 would never be. But that's not even the whole story. Let me tell you what else Earl was doing with that tractor, because this is where it gets interesting. Starting in 1964, a year after Calvin Prout's little performance at the Farm Bureau meeting, Earl began doing custom tillage work for his neighbors during the off-season. 3 of the smaller farms near him, the Hendricks Place, the Wachter operation, the widow Sorensen's 80 acres, had operators who were getting older, whose equipment was unreliable, who needed someone they could trust to come in and do fall tillage and spring seedbed prep at a reasonable price. Earl charged $8 an acre for fall chisel plowing, $6 for spring disking, and he was available and he showed up when he said he would and the work was right. Between 1964 and 1985, working within a 10-mile radius of his home farm, Earl Maddox earned an additional income from custom work that totaled, by his own accounting in that composition notebook, just over $31,000. He kept the overhead on that side of his operation to almost nothing because the central piece of equipment was a machine he'd already paid for 15 years earlier. $31,000 over 20 years isn't a fortune. But in Hardin County, Iowa, during a period that included the commodity price collapse of the mid-70s, the interest rate crisis of the early 80s, and the beginning of the worst farm depression since the 1930s, $31,000 in supplemental income was the difference between a farm that was slightly ahead of its obligations and a farm that was drowning. Earl Maddox was slightly ahead of his obligations. That was the knowledge, that was the thing nobody else could see. That old red Farmall M wasn't just a tractor. It was a revenue stream, it was insurance. It was 25 years of quiet, patient, invisible financial strategy. And in October of 1988, it was about to become something even more than that. Let me take you back to that shed. October 7, 1988, 4:47 in the morning. Earl's combine, a 1979 International 1480 that he'd bought used in 1983 for $11,400, had thrown a cracked cylinder head 3 days earlier, right in the middle of his east field with about 110 acres of soybeans still standing. The soybeans were ready. More than ready. Every day they sat in the field was another day of moisture fluctuation, another day of pod shatter, another day of yield loss that he couldn't afford. He'd called International Harvester's dealer in Iowa Falls. They could get him a rebuilt head in 4 to 6 days, maybe. Maybe. Parts availability was a disaster in 1988. IH had restructured itself into Case IH 2 years earlier, and the supply chain for some of the older model components was, charitably speaking, a mess. 4 to 6 days. The bank's deadline for his next quarterly loan payment, a payment on a note he'd taken out in 1981 to buy the 80 acres of Sorensen ground at what turned out to be the exact worst possible moment in the history of Iowa land prices, was October 10th, 3 days away. If he missed that payment, the Federal Land Bank of Omaha had made very clear in writing that they would begin foreclosure proceedings. Earl had already been through one restructuring with them in 1986. There was no more flexibility. No more goodwill, just arithmetic. He needed to finish those soybeans. He needed to deliver them to the elevator in Eldora. And he needed the cash to hit his bank account before October 10th. He stood in that shed at 4:47 in the morning, and he looked at the Farmall M. Now let me be precise about this, because precision matters. A 1948 Farmall M was not a combine. Earl's combine was a dedicated harvesting machine that could cut and thresh soybeans at a rate that would have taken the old M years to match. The M couldn't harvest soybeans alone. But what Earl had sitting in the back corner of that shed under a canvas tarp that hadn't moved in several years was a 2-row soybean picker head, an old International Harvester 3300 series pull-type combine attachment that he had bought at an estate auction in Franklin County in 1971 for $125. He had never told anyone about it. He hadn't used it in 8 years. He kept it because he was Earl Maddox, and Earl Maddox did not throw things away. He had bought it because, in the back of his mind, in the place where quiet men keep the plans that they never discuss, he understood that modern equipment breaks down. He understood that there are moments in farming when your margin for error is zero, and the only thing that saves you is something old and simple and within your ability to fix with what you have on hand. He pulled the tarp off that old combine head. He checked it over with a flashlight. 2 hours of work, greasing fittings, adjusting the gathering chains, replacing one worn sickle section from a parts bin he kept on a shelf above his workbench. By 6:15 in the morning, as the sky over Hardin County turned the color of a bruised peach, Earl Maddox had that Farmall M hitched to the pull-type combine head, and he was pulling out of his machine shed. He drove it down the gravel road to his east field in the early morning dark, the old engine ticking steadily, the exhaust pipe sending a thin plume of smoke up into the cold air. And then, in the growing light of a Friday morning in October, Earl Maddox began to harvest soybeans with a tractor that Calvin Prout had told him to scrap 25 years ago. I want you to understand what this looked like. The Farmall M moved through that field at roughly 2 miles an hour. At 2 miles an hour with a 2-row head, Earl was cutting a swath of soybeans that measured approximately 5 feet wide. His combine, when it worked, covered 15 feet in a single pass at 5 miles per hour. The math is not encouraging. But here is what Earl knew and what the math alone can't tell you. He had 110 acres of soybeans left to harvest. He had 3 days. If he ran 16 hours a day in 2-hour shifts broken by refueling and minor maintenance, he could cover, by his own rough calculation, worked out on the back of a grain ticket stub while he drove approximately 50 to 60 acres in those 3 days. Not all of it, but enough. Because not all of those soybeans were the same. Earl knew his ground. He knew that the 30 acres on the east end of the field along the creek bottom were the heaviest yielding. He knew that those 30 acres, at current prices of roughly $5.60 a bushel, with a yield he conservatively estimated at 42 bushels per acre, would gross him somewhere in the neighborhood of $7,000. His quarterly payment to the Federal Land Bank of Omaha was $6,400. He didn't need to harvest everything. He needed to harvest those 30 acres. He would have to work every available hour of daylight. He would have to navigate a soybean head that hadn't operated in 8 years, pulled by a tractor that was 40 years old, across ground that he knew intimately, but that was uneven and demanding. He could do it. He knew he could do it. And so he did. 16 hours on Friday, 16 hours on Saturday, broken by 4 hours of sleep on a cot in the shed. The smell of diesel exhaust and dry soybean dust and the particular earthy sweetness of freshly threshed beans filled the grain wagon behind him. The sound of the old farmhouse engine, steady and rhythmic, unwavering, not fast, not impressive by any modern standard, but running. Running when it had to run, doing the work it had to do, hour after hour without complaint. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever seen something old prove itself against all expectations? Not in a dramatic way necessarily, not with fireworks, just quietly, steadily, just by continuing to function when everything around it has failed. There is something in that, something that matters, and I think you know what I mean. By Sunday evening, October 9th, the day before the bank's deadline, Earl Maddox had harvested 34 acres of his best soybean ground. He had a grain wagon full to within 2 inches of the top. He had one more thing to do. He called Gary Hofstadter, the same man who'd put a hand on his shoulder after the Farm Bureau meeting 25 years ago, and asked if he could borrow his grain truck on Monday morning. Gary Hofstadter didn't ask why, he said yes. On the morning of October 10, 1988, Earl Maddox backed a borrowed grain truck up to the elevator on 2nd Street in Eldora at 7:45 in the morning. The elevator manager, a younger man named Dennis Krebs who'd taken over from his father 3 years earlier, weighed the load and handed Earl the scale ticket. 34 acres, average yield of 44 bushels per acre. 1,496 bushels of number 2 soybeans at $5.58 per bushel. Total $8,347.68. Earl stood at the elevator window and looked at that number for a long time. Then he folded the ticket, put it in his shirt pocket, and drove to the Federal Land Bank branch office on Main Street, where he walked in and made his payment of $6,400 in full with cash remaining. The loan officer, a man named Richard Vanek, who had been through this particular kind of moment many times in the previous 3 years, and had not enjoyed a single one of them, looked at Earl across his desk. "You got it in," Richard said. "I got it in," Earl said. There was a silence between them that contained everything: 3 years of restructuring conversations, of phone calls with bad news, of the kind of quiet desperation that the farm crisis of the 1980s produced in men who had never once in their lives expected to be desperate. Richard Vanek reached across the desk and shook Earl's hand. "I'm glad," he said, and he meant it. Earl drove home. He pulled into his yard. He got out of his truck and he walked into his machine shed and he put his hand on the hood of the farmhouse, still warm from Sunday's work. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Let me tell you what happened in the years that followed. Earl got his combine head repaired that November. The rebuilt head arrived from Case IH after 8 days, was installed in a single afternoon and cost him $432. He finished the rest of his soybean harvest before the end of October, yielding a final average across all his ground of 41 bushels per acre. It was, by the standards of what the 1988 drought had done to most of the Corn Belt, a genuinely good year for him. He made every subsequent loan payment on time. He negotiated a reduced principal on the Sorensen ground in 1990, when land values in Hardin County had stabilized enough that the bank was willing to restructure rather than foreclose. By 1993, he had paid off the note entirely. He farmed the Maddox ground for 5 more years, until 1993, when he was 71 years old and his knees had made their final argument about the subject. He sold the operation, land and equipment both, to his nephew, Daniel Maddox, who farms it to this day. The farmhouse was not sold. Daniel kept it. It sits in the same machine shed where Earl worked on it for 38 years, painted and maintained, still running. Daniel's daughter, Earl's great-niece, a girl named Hazel who is 11 years old as of this telling, has learned to drive it in the south pasture on summer afternoons. She doesn't know the whole story yet, but she will. Now let me tell you about Calvin Pruitt. Calvin's John Deere dealership on Highway 20 east of Eldora closed in March of 1986. The farm crisis had been hard on farm equipment dealers. When farmers can't pay their loans and can't justify new equipment purchases, implement dealers find themselves holding floor plan financing on machines they can't move, and the math turns ugly very quickly. Calvin had expanded his inventory in 1981 and 1982, right at the peak of the boom, financing heavily on the expectation that prices and demand would continue rising. They didn't. By 1985, Calvin was negotiating with John Deere Finance and 3 Iowa banks simultaneously. By March of 1986, he had sold the dealership assets at auction, settled his debts at roughly 60 cents on the dollar, and moved back to Davenport. He was not a bad man. Let me say that again because it matters. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had confused the appearance of progress with the thing itself, who had confused the newest equipment with the best equipment, who had confused his own comfort with expertise. There is something in that story that deserves compassion alongside its lesson. But let me tell you something that Earl Maddox said, only once, to his daughter Ruth, sometime in the early 1990s, when she asked him about that Farm Bureau meeting and the old M and everything that had happened. Ruth had said, "Daddy, did you always know that tractor was going to matter that much?" Earl was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I knew it mattered to me, that was enough." Let me pause there with you for just a moment. I knew it mattered to me, that was enough. In 38 years of listening to farmers talk about their relationship with their land and their equipment, I have never heard a more complete answer to the question of why men like Earl Maddox do what they do. Not for vindication, not to prove a point, not to be right when someone else was wrong. Just because they knew in the quiet and unargued center of their own understanding that the thing they were doing was right. That's not stubbornness. Don't make the mistake of calling it stubbornness. That's faith, faith in your own knowledge, your own judgment, the accumulated wisdom of your hands and your years. Faith that what you understand is real, even when the room is laughing. Let me tell you the thing that Earl Maddox understood that Calvin Pruitt never did. Value is not the same thing as price. The Farmall M in 1963 had a market value of perhaps $150 as a trade-in, maybe less. Calvin Pruitt was not wrong about that number. But he was catastrophically wrong about everything it didn't measure, the knowledge invested in it, the trust built around it, the decades of income it had quietly generated, and the specific, irreplaceable role it played in the farming system of one particular man on one particular piece of ground. He looked at that tractor and he saw a number. Earl looked at that tractor and he saw a partner. And the difference between those two ways of seeing the world, the difference between the man who assigns value from the outside and the man who knows value from the inside, is the difference between a dealership that closed in 1986 and a farm that survived to the 1990s. We live in a world that wants to move quickly, that wants you to upgrade, replace, update, or trade in. That measures progress in model years and horsepower ratings and the distance between what you have and what you could have if you just signed on the line. And sometimes that's true, sometimes the new thing is genuinely better, sometimes the upgrade matters. But sometimes, not always, not even often, but sometimes the old thing is enough. The old thing, understood deeply and maintained faithfully and trusted completely, is exactly what the moment requires. Earl Maddox knew that. He knew it in 1963 when the room laughed at him. He knew it in 1988 when he pulled that tarp off a pull-type combine head at 5 in the morning. He knew it when he handed over his loan payment at the Federal Land Bank on October 10th. He never said a word about it to Calvin Pruitt. He never needed to. Some lessons are too large for the man who most needs to learn them. And some vindications are too quiet for a crowd. They happen in machine sheds before daylight, with a cold hand on an old hood and a voice barely above a whisper. "All right, old girl, one more times." And the old machine answers. It always answers. Because that's what happens when you don't throw away the things that matter.